I am joined by filmmakers of Public Trust, director David Byars, also producer of the film, Jeremy Rubingh. Also with us and featured in the film are Joel Clement, public lands policy expert, and Angelo, Baca, activist and filmmaker. And David, I want to start with you, and I want to talk about how the project came to be. You were with us in Washington, D.C. back in 2018 with your first feature doc, No Man's Land. And there is a public land component to that. The film centered around the occupation of the Mahler National Wildlife Reserve in Oregon. So since we last saw you at the festival, talk us through how the new film Public Trust developed.
Sure. So with No Man's Land, it really started with kind of the story of the Bundys occupying the Mahler Refuge, and then kind of left upwards from there into a more topical exploration of relevant themes, whether it's, helplessness in America, public lands issues, et cetera. And so what we did with what that kind of really nailed home for me is that I was very much just scratching the surface of a much larger topic, that being of public lands. And so I wanted to return to that somehow, but I didn't really exactly know how to, just because it's such a huge topic. And not only is it a huge physical object being 640 million acres of land, it's also, it has deep philosophical implications, historical context, and also as part of our history of the United States, warts and all. And so I was kind of facing down this kind of daunting task, and just kind of really thinking about it and not really planning on doing it. And then I met Jeremy, and he, has spent his life doing this whole thing, steeped in public lands and stuff like that. And then that's when we decided to kind of join forces on this, in terms of, making a more essay style film that kind of addresses macro public land story and issues as well.
Well, and Jeremy, as David mentioned, 640 million acres of public lands across the U.S. In the film, you put a spotlight on three different areas, three threats in Utah, Minnesota, and Alaska. So talk about how you chose those locations, the subjects who were profiled as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could make a film about public lands in any state in the union, and it could be entertaining and rife with conflict and all of that. It was important to us to kind of try to, we wanted to provide an overview so that Americans can understand what these public lands really are. And in that is, a pretty interesting history, and not all of it's fun to look at. There's a lot of gnarly stuff there too. These lands essentially were taken from native ancestral, their native lands. And we really have to look at, it's a tough pill to swallow when you look at the whole story. But it was obvious very early on that we wanted to get at the diversity of these places as well as some of that history. And so a natural starting point for us was Utah. Literally the first day we shot was in Salt Lake City, the day President Trump arrived to make his proclamation to rescind Bears Ears and Grand Staircase national monuments and reduce them. So it was obvious to us that Utah was the tip of the spear, but truly it's the people in these places that kind of helped direct us, and that's what rose to the top. Certainly working with Angelo and meeting Angelo and other folks, it was obvious to us that this part of the public land story needed to be told, and it needed to be one of the main focuses. But likewise, you talk about diversity. We feature the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Arctic landscape. That is a part of the American public land system, and a very important one to the Gwich'in and their food sustainability and food security and our planet. In fact, it's one of the last intact Arctic regions. And then we met Spencer Shaver kind of on a whim. We were at a barbecue with a sportsman group called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers that's featured in the film. And he was telling us about the boundary waters and the threat of this mine. And I said to Dave, let's go look at this. This is an interesting thing. And so then you have this region of lakes. We call it the blue collar wilderness. It's very approachable to a lot of people. It's the most visited wilderness in America. You can just get in a canoe or go for a little hike, and have an incredible time for weeks. And people from all over the Midwest and the East use that landscape, visit that landscape, appreciate that landscape. And so all three of these places help tell kind of a broader, diverse story that's going on everywhere, and all have underpinnings in a lot of the same issues. So the choice to kind of hone in on those three geographies was driven really by the amazing people we met in each one, but also the fact that it helps show this diversity.
And Angelo, turning to you, you're an activist, scholar, filmmaker yourself. You had a film that came through the festival a few years ago, Shashja, Bear's Ears. And I wanted to start with talking about a sequence. You and Hal are in a plane, and it's visually impactful. We're seeing a bird's eye view of the destruction of the land, of your land. This is a land you grew up on in San Juan County. I didn't mention this, you're a competitive runner as well. You trained on the land. So you touched on it in the film, but reiterate what the land means to you and your community there.
Yeah, I think the complexities of the indigenous perspective are very difficult to translate across the screen, and so that's why that short Shashja Bear's Ears documentary film that I did was from my own personal perspective, my own native viewpoint as a Navajo and Hopi person, teachings that my grandparents gave me, culturally and linguistically informed. And it's still a challenge. It's still a challenge in public lands context, in national monument context, in talking about policy and how leadership really lacks the language and the understanding to comprehend just how deeply spiritually and culturally significant this land is for us. And so we don't really see a difference between the health of the land and the health of the people, because both of them are tied to each other. And that's always been something that is talked about and referred to like a relative. So when you take care of the landscape, it takes care of you. And it's like your grandpa or your grandmother, And so you give them the proper time and attention and focus and care. And that conversation has been elevated, especially today, because when you're talking about issues of COVID and safety of health, you also want to take care of the land, because the land takes care of you. There's water, there's medicine, there's firewood, there's plants and animals that we still use and sustain. And those are incredibly important now for protecting for future generations.
Well, and Angela, I also wanted to talk about your activism, and please do tell us a little bit too about the nonprofit that you're involved in. It's Indigenous led, and talk about the work you're currently doing, continuing to advocate, and also the importance of the Native community having a say in how ancestral public lands are managed as well.
Yeah, so currently I am a PhD candidate, a PhD student at New York University in the Department of Anthropology. I'm also a cultural resources coordinator for Utah Denebekea, an indigenous-led conservation group. And it's a board composed of local elders and community members, leaders, folks who inform what we do with traditional knowledge. And that has always been, I think, in particularly for me, a very personal and professional, I guess, endeavor in trying to get those two on the same page with Western and traditional knowledge, because I believe that they inform each other, and one without the other is incomplete. Especially now when we're talking about land management and environmental issues, we really want to have the dual perspective, even though there's like multiple perspectives within that, and trying to figure out what that means for long-term sustainability of our landscapes and our environments. And, it's always been something that we've been practicing, and we have quite a bit of knowledge to offer in that way. And it does matter, I think, in terms of land management planning and policy, but especially now more than ever, I think what the focus has to be on is like the whole paradigm shift of the mentality, the thinking of old ways of conservation and preservation. We know they're not that great. We know that they're super limited, and sometimes they don't even work that very well. So when you're talking about going back, you've got to talk to the people who have been there for generations. the ones who have been on those lands and know those areas, the plants, the animals, the waterways, the canyons, the mountains, the flora, fauna, geography, all of that, just on its basic core, it's observational data over millennia, since time immemorial. And it just makes sense that if you're a scientist, you want to talk to those people. And it also makes sense that if you want to know how important it is relationally, that you understand what their epistemology is, what the cosmological and universally, biologic connections are for the people and the land interacting, because they obviously help each other out and they have lessons to offer and lessons to give. And I think we see that now, especially when it comes to like fires and water and harvesting certain plants. These are very much, concerns of ours, and it's not like we haven't been active in these concerns. I just think that now more than ever, it's becoming especially an issue where we have to act fast. We already see like the ice shelves are melting. The summer's really hot. Everything's on fire, and there's pandemic raging. And I think that's just the start. So when we talk about this stuff, we talk about this stuff from the past to the present to the future. It's all connected. And so we kind of do ourselves a disservice when we think in a Western linear way where we chop things up and compartmentalize and then we don't see the big picture.
And Joel, thanks for also being with us. And when I saw you in the film, I did remember your Washington Post op-ed from 2017. And I just wanted to read quickly a few lines of that because it's just as relevant today. And you write, quote, "I am not a member of the deep state. I am not big government. I am a scientist, a policy expert, a civil servant, and a worried citizen. Reluctantly, as of today, I'm also a whistleblower on an administration that chooses silence over science." And again, it seems like that is across the board for this administration, certainly with respect to how the pandemic's been handled. But Joel, I'd be curious to hear your perspective looking back at what you wrote 3 years ago, as well as any thoughts on what's transpired with the administration since with regard to science and land management.
Well, thanks, Brad. And first of all, greetings from the state of Maine. This is the ancestral home of the Wabanaki people, the people of the Don. I want to build on something Angelo said, because the notion that you take care of the land and it takes care of you, it can be taken to the national level, right? I mean, at this time of rapid climate change, the land, it's all about clean water, clean air, carbon storage in soil, pollination, and so many of the ecosystem services we depend on are because we've got this incredibly vast federal estate of lands. And I don't think most Americans are aware of just how special that is. So I think that's one of the reasons this film is so important. But Angelo also mentioned the role of indigenous knowledge, and you asked me about science. And one of the ways we know that this administration is trying to break government is they're undercutting knowledge. And most policy decisions are meant to be based on, we usually say science, but as Angelo pointed out, there's a much bigger perspective out there. And we're working harder to figure out how we can better incorporate indigenous knowledge into these, quote unquote, scientific opinions about things. Either way, this administration is undercutting both, right? So they're going with pet theories and ideas about how to cure COVID. They've been doing the same thing with public lands and handing them over to the fossil fuel interests. So that sort of MO, that modus operandus has been going from the start. So when I wrote that op-ed in 2017, 6 months into the administration, it was becoming ominous, the clouds on the horizon. They were going after science already. They were going after me and other experts. They were trying to undercut the people in the career ranks who could make land management decisions based on the best available science. And that continues to this day. In fact, it's gotten almost, if it weren't so tragic, it would be comical. It's almost sociopathic the way they're going after these very obvious things that we need to do, right? Whether it's the EPA and getting toxic chemicals out of households in poor neighborhoods, or whether it's protecting the public lands from obvious incursions and the fossil fuel industry, which frankly, we're seeing this in the Arctic Refuge now. They're going to try and get a lease sale done up there, but nobody wants that oil and gas right now. The prices are low. It doesn't pencil out, but they want to get this in the books because it is a line in the sand. They want to be seen as having done in the 4 years of this administration, hopefully that's all there is, that they have successfully assaulted those environmental positions, those indigenous positions, those positions that are important to the land. And that has continued unabated. So, I'd like to say, since I wrote that op-ed, things have tapered off. They got it out of their system early, but really they've just been picking up steam all along. And hopefully these last few months of the administration, they will continue to flail in some ways, because the silver lining is they're not very good at what they're doing. And because they're sloppy and mostly doing illegal and unethical things, the courts are stopping many of these things. And that's true of both pipelines and just decisions on Bureau of Land Management land to go ahead and drill. So thankfully they're bad at it, but unfortunately they've been given nothing. There's nothing holding them back because Mitch McConnell in the Senate and so on, there's no accountability for the executive branch. So the problem continues unabated, but hopefully we'll see a change on the horizon coming up.
And I know, Jeremy or David too, I know since you finished the film, the news cycle is full of politics and pandemic, but public lands are still in the news, obviously. Talk about any updates too that you'd like to share.
But yeah, there are some really interesting updates and a lot of interesting politics that come around with the election cycle. We just had an interviewer ask us this morning about, what's the status of the land transfer movement and where is that? And I think it's really interesting. You have, as sort of a default de facto acting BLM director, a guy named William Perry Penley, who's built his entire career on trying to advocate for the transfer of public lands, which would then, of course, lead to their privatization or their development, no longer in the public estate. And so in a legally dubious move, because they knew that if they forced a Senate confirmation vote on William Perry Penley, there'd be some very vulnerable United States senators, chiefly Cory Gardner in Colorado and Daines in Montana, who'd be forced to vote on Trump's nominee for the BLM director in places where you don't mess with public lands. In fact, I think it would be very much the end of their campaigns if they were to confirm somebody like him. So now he's just sort of acting in that role because they're just sort of leaving it vacant. And so you have these people in these agencies that are undermining the very thing that they're supposed to be protecting or working to develop solutions for. That's one kind of interesting update, is that that's ongoing. But you also have, as Joel referred to, a decision last week, a record of decision from the Trump administration to hold lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. A record of decision is a pretty big deal. But once you actually hold a lease sale, that's a much bigger deal. That's a much more difficult thing to unravel and figure out how to properly protect this place. And again, if you watch the film, you're talking about the last intact Arctic landscape, the last complete true wild wilderness of this country. I think Douglas Brinkley called it America's Serengeti. But, and Bernadette, I think, does a beautiful job of showing people how important it is to the people who depend on that landscape. I think Angelo is probably much better equipped to tell us about the updates in Utah than I am right now, but I'll speak a little bit to the boundary waters in Minnesota. There's a bill that would protect the watershed, and it would be mineral withdrawal and would protect the surrounding area around the boundary waters. It's working its way through subcommittees, and things are stalled out in Congress right now as people are coming back from recess and all of that the priorities with COVID and all these things shuffle around. But there's a promising bill in the House, but it would need to pass the Senate. And we have a reluctant leadership in the Senate to do anything that would protect public lands, in all honesty, especially in a place where there's a foreign mining company that could benefit off of those mining activities. Those are sort of the general things, but it couldn't be more obvious to me that this is the most important election, if you care about public lands, that you will probably have in your lifetime. You have an administration that's removed over 34 million acres from protection. I think it's fair to say it is the least favorable administration in history towards our environment and our public lands. No other president has removed more land from protection than they've protected of either party. So it's the update is that we're in a really critical moment for public lands. And I really do think I would like to hear from Angelo, so I have a better answer. What's going on in Utah right now?
Well, I think that most of, the discussion is centering on the lawsuits that are still in motion. I think there's discussion on whether or not, is it better to see it through or is it better to wait? And so that's kind of where it's at. I'm not really kind of allowed to comment further than that since I'm not the legal department. Don't got my suit and tie on me. But I do think it is really interesting. I mean, if you look at some of the Democratic Party platforms and some of what the candidates have said, they have said some very explicit things about what they would do with parks and monuments in terms of a new administration. I encourage people to look at that because it does look favorable in terms of a restoration, whatever that might look like.
And I know before we kind of close up shop here, I know if we were standing in a theater in Washington, D.C. right now taking questions, no doubt the question would come up, what can we do? Obviously, voting has come up. There is a call to action at the end of the film, but talk about any other action items, other resources that any of you would point people toward.
I'll jump in because I try to make a point of this every time. And this was actually featured during the Democratic National Convention quite prominently. I should say I'm neither a Democrat nor a Republican, so I'm not saying this as a partisan, but the concept of public service is important and serving, right? Whether it's in the military or otherwise. I think that it's time to reboot the public service so that this is a thing that people want to do. So I say when I speak at universities and colleges, consider public service. Get into the career ranks of the federal government because they're the ones that are keeping this train on the tracks right now. We've got an administration that is quite corrupt, and it's the career folks that are keeping it going. So consider a career in public service. Think about working at an environmental agency or any agency, and jump right in. Obviously, vote in November as well.
I think maybe also a thing to consider, and I think a lot of the early audiences we talked about when we screened this film in Montana had the same idea and question, which was like, okay, an election year is coming. We're all going to do our votes and then what now? What's next kind of thing. And I think that's really important to pursue those particular interests in the localities where we're at, in terms of policy and leadership and elected positions and just being involved in trying to take care of whatever geography you're in and developing that relationship with the indigenous communities that live there. I think, all of them have their own investment in taking care of those lands because, that relationship is deep and ongoing and it matters to them. And so it's kind of time to start looking beyond the little siloed sections we've been working in and break down some of those barriers. And I think that's really a conversation that's been happening all through 2020 in terms of racism, discrimination, the protests. We've been doing business as usual and it hasn't been working. And people have been trying to desperately get your attention to do that. A friend of mine said a great analogy, which was it's like there's the nice apartment upstairs that the folks of color are not in, and they're underneath it, and the water is leaking, and all this terrible stuff is coming down from the top, and we're trying to get their attention to be like, hey, this needs fixing, But people are so involved into that little section that they're in that they're not seeing the bigger picture. And I think that's really important for us to understand that we're going to be demanded and asked for more than what we have been before. Everything that we've done with conservation, everything that we've done with policy, with administration, elected positions, we got to do more, and we have to radically rethink that. And we're in a position where it's like we're kind of running out of time, so we need to do that quickly, and we need to do it together.
Yeah, I'll go real quick. I think one thing that's kind of sustained me through this is just learning more about public lands, learning what public lands I'm on, or what lands I'm on and where they come from and stuff, and understand that you're part of a continuously populated landscape for thousands of years. And like for me, that's a very comforting and aspirational thing as well, is that I want to be part of this continuum who cares about this land and who wants to make sure that this stays in some inhabitable or at least beautiful, pristine disposition for generations to come, and find people to go out and enjoy these public lands with. Like the more connection you can get with this land, the better you're going to feel about it. And it's also very, very healing, particularly when you're looking at Twitter and Instagram and the news and stuff like that, and you're seeing these things that are happening that are terrible, and you just feel like you're losing all the time. I think it really serves you well to go out and get out on these lands and really just take a deep breath and understand that they're here, and it's important, and kind of refresh your energy for the fight that's to come. I
guess the only thing I'd add to this is that it's pretty much like anything in our democracy. If we want public lands to exist, then we're going to have to show up as engaged citizens. And we're going to have to fight for it. And, we're learning now that we really need to broaden our umbrella, our tent, and be more inclusive. I mean, I think too often public lands and the people who use them are portrayed, they're people who look like me. And the reality is there's communities who don't feel safe and haven't felt invited to the party. And there's a lot of important work that needs to be done there. And that includes thinking beyond just an election cycle. Angelo has been really good about pointing this out, is like, we weren't doing enough really before we even had some of these monuments. So it's not going to be enough just to reverse what Trump has done. There's some amazing initiatives out there, like the 30 by 30 campaign for nature that's looking to protect 30% of land and waters across the globe. There are so many opportunities for us to get involved, be mentors, or listen, and just show up and listen to what other people need in order to experience public lands and advocate for them. And I'm actually really hopeful. I think, the people that Dave and I have met making this film have given us a lot of optimism, actually, because we've got the winners on our side, including these guys here with us right now. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to go much further than we've gone back.
I just had one more thought, Brad, when you were talking about things you can do, and Jeremy alluded to this, and maybe he more than alluded to it, but when we talk about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the healthcare crisis, all the things we've referred to today, they're all amplified by and made worse by the social justice crisis that Jeremy was referring to. And they are environmental justice issues, they're social justice issues. And so the thing we can do in addition to, and the thing we can do better, is acknowledge, support, and lift indigenous voices, people of color, organizations that are out there trying to expand the constituency for public lands and climate action. And I think that that's about as important as it could be right now. So this social justice crisis right now couldn't be more front of mind than it's ever been. And we need to act. We can't just let things slide again, as we've done so often in the past. So hopefully people will take it to heart.
Well, yeah, thank you all for your time. And again, Joel, Angelo, thank you so much for the work y'all are doing. And David, Jeremy, thanks for the film and the opportunity to share with our audience.
Yeah, thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad. Good to meet you, Angelo, and we'll see you guys later. Nice job with the big hat again, Jeremy. A new one every time.
I'll get you one soon, bud.